Haji was printed in Jawi and Rumi editions and distributed to schools, government sectors, and publics. The copies of Tabung Haji Monthly News were also increased from time to time to increase the distribution. Additionally, campaigns to the post service was also carried out. A brochure titled "How Can You Become a Depositor at Tabung Haji" was distributed to the Malays whose name was listed in the 1983 phone guidebook. As a result of this campaign, many Malays started their savings to the salary card scheme for individual and family. Explanation through Friday sermons was also provided with cooperation from the Islamic Department of Federal Territory. The calls for Muslims to save at Tabung Haji were delivered through Friday sermons simultaneously at all mosques in the Federal Territory in 1983. Brochures and information materials were also given to all imams at the mosque to be distributed during the Friday prayers. Tabung Haji had implemented several marketing strategies from time to time to encourage the participation of the Malays. Tabung Haji put great emphasis on memberships through the salary card year scheme, when the campaign to obtain new members through this scheme was intensified. The student savings schemes were also launched in 1984 with the aim to encourage students at the school level to be thrifty and to save for their future through children's saving box. In the beginning, 20,000 free saving boxes were distributed to students throughout the country who became a member with saving of no less than 5 ringgit, and the response was very encouraging. One of the main attractions of Tabung Haji was the payment of zakat for property and income from the investment of the deposits. The Fatwa Committee of the National Council for Islamic Affairs had issued a ruling in 1979, making it compulsory for Tabung Haji to pay this zakat. Tabung Haji began paying zakat to the State Islamic Department in 1980 based on the balance of depositors' saving in each state. 86 million had been paid to the Islamic departments throughout Malaysia in 2019 compared to 59 million in 2015. Tabung Haji zakat payment has helped many people in poverty and needs and implemented economic projects aimed at improving the socio-economic positions of the Malays. To attract more membership, Lembaga Tabung Haji had abolished the conditions limiting withdrawal of deposit only for Hajj purposes beginning in 1975. Tabung Haji's policy to only participated in investment that guarantee at least 10% return, provide the investment do not go against the principle of Islam. In ensuring that Tabung Haji only participated in halal investment, at the very beginning, Tabung Haji referred all of its investment activities to the Bank Islam Malaysia Berhad Syariah Advisory Council because Tabung Haji did not have its own advisory council. Now, Tabung Haji has its own Syariah Advisory Committee. In line with the policy of applying Islamic values in government administration, various parties had suggested for the government to exempt Muslims who had performed Hajj from the income tax. This suggestion also received support from the Malaysian Ulama Association. Beginning 1st January 1982, bonus for depositors was exempted from income tax. Tabung Haji also established a synergy with Islamic banking institutions to enable withdrawal of cash through ATM as another facility for its depositors. In the beginning, Tabung Haji provided the facility using Bank Islam Malaysia Berhad ATM network throughout the countries because Tabung Haji is its biggest shareholder. Then, other facilities such as express check terminal and internet banking are also provided. Tabung Haji is also planning to provide mobile counter services to serve the public, especially those in the rural areas. Challenges in providing services. Ever since its establishment in 1969, Tabung Haji had faced various challenges which put to test their credibility as the sole body entrusted by the Malaysian government with the responsibility to manage the Malays Hajj pilgrimage. One of the biggest challenges faced by Tabung Haji was the competition from the private agencies. The private companies had no direct relationship with Tabung Haji, but they arranged the Malay trip to the Holy Land. The involvement of private agencies began ever since the establishment of Tabung Haji because Tabung Haji was not able to provide the transportation for all Malaysian pilgrims at the time. Since 1978, Lembaga Tabung Haji had amplified the effort to restrict the involvement of private Hajj operators. Private agencies were no longer allowed to arrange because Tabung Haji was able to handle the pilgrim's flight on its own. The difficulties caused by the private agencies were often published widely in the local newspapers in 1970s and 1980s. There were various episodes of unfortunate events for the Hajj pilgrims under private agencies every year. Some of them were stranded halfway, some had managed their own food and drinks and transportations, and some had to seek help from families back home for expenses and the return trip, forcing their families to struggle to raise money. According to Tabung Haji Act 1969, a person who brought Hajj pilgrims to Mecca without permission from Tabung Haji or the Malaysian government could be penalized up to 30,000 ringgit. Tabung Haji full authority for management of Hajj affairs was further strengthened by the Arab Saudis' decision to only issue visa for pilgrims using Tabung Haji services beginning in 1981. Tabung Haji decided to block welfare and medical services for pilgrims who did not go through Tabung Haji. Tabung Haji's effort to rescue companies affected by the economic downturn, including the Malaysian airline system, was also met with strong criticism. Tunku Abdul Aziz expressed his disapproval of the move, stating that Tabung Haji is not a Red Crescent society that is responsible to rescue failing companies in Malaysia. The proposition must take into consideration the sensitivity of the Malay Muslims because alcohol served in flight is forbidden in Islam, and the money was invested by prospective pilgrims to fulfill the pillars of Islam. Tabung Haji used to own shares in MAS, but has since released its shares in the company gradually since 1989 following objections from the Muslims. Tabung Haji had made many efforts to regain the Malay trust. Articles were published to explain the roles of Tabung Haji ever since its inception. Opinions of various figures were taken to convince the people that investment profit should not be their main goal. Tabung Haji also continuously looked for new initiatives to increase its roles and contributions to Hajj pilgrims and its depositors. Tabung Haji operates an office in Jeddah, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, under the purview of Malaysian Consulate. In 2019, Tabung Haji has 125 branches with 10,000 touch points nationwide. As a conclusion, a few decades after its establishment, Tabung Haji had saved the Malays from burden of debts. Many assets and properties of the Malays were saved from being sold or pawned. Before the establishment of Tabung Haji, Malays who wanted to perform Hajj were willing to pawn their lands and house, sell their livestock and jewelry, and various other methods to fund their expenses to Mecca. When they could not buy their land back and replace loose properties, they spent their life in act of worship without caring for the worldly matters. However, this negative situation was slowly stopped after the government established Tabung Haji. The establishment of Tabung Haji proved that the government cares to provide facilities for Malays to save up little by little to perform Hajj without having to sell off their properties and live in poverty upon return from the Holy Land of Mecca. Tabung Haji is not only responsible for the welfare of the Hajj pilgrims in terms of health, transportation, and accommodation, but it also protects the pilgrims from any form of scam and exploitation from various parties. The Malays' experience of various difficulties has also slowly changed with the implementation of Hajj management system that is more systematic. Tabung Haji should learn from the previous mistakes and weaknesses and from time to time to improve the quality of its services. Despite all criticisms and the challenges, Tabung Haji strives to provide excellent Hajj services to Malaysian pilgrims, and its consistent track record has gained world recognition as a role model for innovative Hajj management. With that, I end my presentation and thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Aiza, for giving a very comprehensive economic history of such an important institution among the Malays in particular and also in Malaysia. I think in the interest of time, I would like to open the floor, the virtual floor, for questions and answers to Dr. Aiza. No one, okay. All right, let just move on, Dr. Aiza. I mean, we are waiting for the participant to sort of come on board to ask the question. Now, I have one, let me start the ball rolling by giving one comment and one question and answer, question for you. My concern, my comment deals directly with your slide number 10 and also slide number 12. I think in terms of the saving of Tabung Haji, it really started with a humble beginning of 45,000 and it ballooned to about 69.4 billion in 2019. And at the same time, you're talking about an institution which play a very traditional role in the early days of Tabung Haji as a saving institution to a conglomerate in which Malaysia is proud of. Now, my comment, you may agree or you may not agree. My concern is this: if it transforms itself into that structure, therefore, whatever the return in terms of dividends, in terms of return of investment, does will be affected by how much you are able to invest or save in Tabung Haji. Therefore, in simple terms, my concern about the role of Tabung Haji in the present state of things, especially among the Bumiputra and the Muslim Malays, is it will eventually generate the gap, the inequality gap that we are concerned. Therefore, a rich and a rich Malay household who earns much more than the poor Malay household will be able to get more returns in terms of dividends as compared to the B40 household. Definitely, if you're talking about T20 and B40 in terms of saving, the T20 will be able to save more as compared to B40. So at the end of the year, you're talking about a dividend returns which will generate much more for the T20 among the Malays. So that by itself have evolved, has sort of contributed toward a concerning widening gap among the Malays themselves. That is my comment, and a study has yet to be established to prove that, okay? But the logic of the market and then how dividends and investment are returns are directly calculated in that way. If you save more, your dividend will be more. So yes, the concern is there will be a gap between T20 and B40. Yes. I hope my fellow academician will take that as one of a very good research area, despite that very interesting economic history of Tabung Haji. Now, my question to you, Dr. Aiza, while we're waiting for the rest to put up question. Tabung Haji started with a very humble beginning, right? Mobilizing the saving of the rural Malays, and over the years, I think it's almost 60 years now, right? Let us put Tabung Haji in the current perspective. How do you think Tabung Haji can redesign, reposition itself, yeah, in light of the poverty that is very rampant in the rural areas, especially among the Malays? Now, can we put the role of Tabung Haji in the way it does in 1960s, right, to address poverty and saving to allow Muslim Malays to perform Hajj, and to put it in the same role, in the same function, right, in the same position in the current situation where poverty in the rural areas is very prevalent, and yet the characteristics and the structure of the rural poverty in the rural area have not changed much. right? They don't have income, they don't have a job, they are poor in terms of access, education and whatnot. The structure of the poverty is very much the same as what you have seen in 1960s. So if there is any room for Tabung Haji in terms of institutional framework, where do you think Tabung Haji should start in addressing the poverty and inequality among the Malays in rural area vis-a-vis the rural and the urban areas? Over to you, Dr. Aiza.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Fatima. I agree with you. I think that the role of Tabung Haji was very good at the very beginning when Unku Abdul Aziz started the establishment of Tabung Haji. He focused mainly to improve the economy of the rural areas Malay. But after some times, when the institutions have become bigger and the government involved in the institution, there had been many challenges in the role in Tabung Haji itself, when they have to focus on many things. At the very beginning, maybe the main focus is to help the Malays in the rural areas to saving for Hajj. But from time to time, when Tabung Haji grew much further, the intention or the attention of Tabung Haji was not directly concerned only for the Malays in the rural areas. I think this is the time for Tabung Haji to look back on their main objectives, to set a strategy, and to maybe academics or experts in economy should combine with Tabung Haji, should sit together and should discuss how Tabung Haji with its great income can play their role in helping the rural Malays, which had not changed much. When Tabung Haji was founded, I think back in 1975, when Tabung Haji decided to abolish the ship, and all pilgrims will travel to Mecca by plane. There was a memorandum sent to Tabung Haji by Sheikh Haji Association. At that time, they plead Tabung Haji to take care of their welfare, meaning that maybe those Sheikh Haji which have been affected by the abolishment of Hajj ship can join Tabung Haji for their career. But the meetings was failed, and none of the action were taken by Tabung Haji at the time. And the Persatuan Sheikh Haji or Sheikh Haji associations, they said that they cannot do anything to help the Sheikh Haji who were affected by the abolishment of the Hajj pilgrim ships. This is one of the example. Although Tabung Haji have built their institution in order to help the Malays, especially to help the economy, maybe there are some loops and holes that Tabung Haji should look back again. And according to what Prof have said just now, maybe this is the good time after the pandemic, where many of us were affected. Then Tabung Haji maybe should play its role in helping and thinking how this institution, the great institution, can help the Malays in the rural areas to improve the economy, as what have been done in back to 1960s.
Okay, Dr. Aiza, there's already 2 questions online. Would you like to answer that? Can you have access to the question? You have access to the question, right? On the message?
How do you
I will
see
give you 8 minutes, the rest of the time that we're having, whatever time that we're having, to address the 2 questions.
Okay, the 2 questions asked me about the leadership of Tabung Haji. What happened to Tabung Haji that have been ruined by the leadership from the politicians? Actually, this is my opinion. Actually, this is the problem with our institutions, and this is the problem Tabung Haji faced from the very beginning. I think in this case, Tabung Haji should be given the authority to play its role as mentioned according to the objectives according to the objectives line for the establishment. I think in this case, the Tabung Haji should not be I think Tabung Haji have should be given a free not be controlled by the politicians in order in order for Tabung Haji to play its role, because if too many political issues in Tabung Haji, the role of Tabung Haji, we can see here today, it has been ruined by the political issues. The malpractices alleged by certain quarters, I do not have a comment on this. Maybe those who manage Tabung Haji have those who manage Tabung Haji have to have their own amanah, because this is an institution to help Muslim, especially Malays, to perform the Hajj and an act of worship of Allah. And if Tabung Haji was messed with all these malpractices or criticism, then it would Tabung Haji would have a bad image, not only not only for Malaysians, but also for all around the world. Then this is why I think the political issues should not be messed up with Tabung Haji, so that Tabung Haji can play their role effectively. This is my own opinion.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Aiza. In the interest of time, I think we only have 3 minutes before we are asked to wrap up. I think in whatever, you have presented a very extensive economic history of Tabung Haji, and then some of the questions are related to the practices and the financial challenges of Tabung Haji. You did mention it well. I think I will just take one word from what the answer that you have given, the question of amanah. That is the key word in the whole thing in terms of looking at the role of Tabung Haji in how it is not purely an economic responsibility, but also a spiritual responsibility for them and also for the Ummah. With that, thank you very much, Dr. Aiza. I think, again, on behalf of all of us, I would like to thank you for coming on board, and also on personal behalf, I would like to thank Dr. Rohana and the team for inviting me to moderate the session. With that, thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Diana. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks, Dr. Aiza and Dr. Fatima Kari for the very interesting session. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a break. We'll meet again at 3 o'clock. We'll meet again 10 minutes after 3 for the next session. See you later.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, great.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We now have a plenary session under the theme Development Through the Lens of Professor Unku Abdul Aziz, a man ahead of his time. We have our first panelist, Professor Dr. Sulochana Nair, from the Vice Chancellor of Binary University of Management and Entrepreneurship, with the topic Poverty, Inequality and Development in Malaysia. The second panelist, Dr. Madeline Burma, the Honorary Professor from the Faculty of Economic and Business, University Malaysia, Sarawak, with the topic Poverty Amidst Plenty, the Paradox of Economic Growth in Sarawak. The third panelist is Dr. Rafik Idris, the Director, Center for Investment, Endowment and Wakaf from University Malaysia, Sabah, with the topic Poverty, Inequality and Development in Sabah. And the fourth panelist, Professor Dr. Cik Wan Ahmad Zawawi Ibrahim, the Adjunct Professor, School of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Taylor's University, Malaysia, with the topic Developmentalism and Economic Marginalization of Indigenous Minorities in Malaysia. It is my pleasure to invite Dr. Hajayatilla Zainal Abidin, the Chief Executive Officer of Yayasan Samdabi, to chair the session. Please welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Diana. Assalamualaikum and a very good afternoon. Firstly, I would like to congratulate the Unku Aziz Center for Development Studies, the UAC, for putting together this very important online conference for us to be reminded of Almarhum Pak Unku's lifelong devotion and various contributions to Malaysia to reduce and ultimately eradicate poverty, and all the impact that we can see today because of his efforts to motivate all of us to continue his great work, which is especially important now in these most challenging times of the pandemic. Today, we shall listen to 4 distinguished speakers on most interesting topics that relate to poverty, inequality, and development. What they will share with us is the hard truth, and I expect it to be a sizzling hot plenary session this afternoon, despite the rainy and gloomy day. Conference participants, you may post your questions in the Q&A box throughout this Zoom session, and we shall try and get as many of them answered as possible at the end of the session. Each esteemed speaker will have 20 minutes to share your insights. And I hope you don't mind me interrupting you when your time is up to let you know to wrap up within the next minute, so that we can provide equal time opportunity for the other speakers, as well as allocate time for the Q&A session. As all the conference participants are provided with the conference booklet that gives you access to the full biography of all our esteemed speakers, I shall just provide a summary of their background to introduce these learned and passionate individuals to you. Let's start with our very first speaker, Professor Dr. Sulochana Nair, who is the Vice Chancellor and CEO of Binary University of Management and Entrepreneurship. With a specialization in development studies, she works on poverty, labor, gender, rural development, and entrepreneurship. Previously, she was attached to the Faculty of Economics and Administration, in various capacities, including the head of the Department of Development Studies, as well as the founding director of the Center for Poverty and Development Studies, a position she was holding when I met her more than a decade ago. This afternoon, we shall hear about Prof. Dr. Sulo's study on the celebrated Almarhum Unku Aziz and his early work, his contributions and influence on the development of the nation, as well as the continued relevance of Unku Aziz's work on all of us today. The floor is yours, Prof. Sulo.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yatila. It's great to meet you again. Distinguished participants, I'm sure that that over the last 2 days, you've heard about various contributions of Professor Unku Aziz, and it's of course very pertinent for me to come and do a presentation on the work of Unku Aziz after his passing, because I was very involved with the setting up of the center and the chair named after Professor Unku Aziz, and that's the time when I had a lot of dealings with him. What I want to do is that many of you, many speakers, the past speakers would have spoken about various aspects of Unku's work. But what I want to do is to bring it back to the original discussion, and also and my own amazement as that because of Professor Unku Aziz picking a topic that is still relevant for after 6 decades. Poverty is still continuing to dominate all the discussions in Malaysia and across the world, and the COVID pandemic has actually contributed to the worsening of poverty situation across the globe, and policies, programs, and projects are absolutely necessary to solve the poverty problem of the people who are already in poverty and those people who have newly entered into poverty as a result of the pandemic and the lockdowns and loss of jobs and incomes. So when I look at the work of Unku Aziz, I go back to his first piece of work and I want to divide my discussion, as long as time permits, into 4 categories. One is to look at Professor Unku's work towards the concepts and measurement of poverty. Secondly, first is the concepts and definition, concepts and definition of poverty. Secondly, the measurement. And thirdly, his contribution to policy. I gave a different summary, but I just want to say, in 1956-57, Professor Unku Aziz began to think about poverty and look at poverty as insufficiency. And way back in 1956, he also said that when we are talking about poverty, there is a suggestion that there are some people who are better off. And this is the root of inequality. So Professor Unku Aziz, way back in 1957, talked not only about poverty, but also inequality. And if you look at the new economic policy and the policy, when there was not much reference to relative poverty or inequality. Inequality was actually put on the back burner. It has come back to the forefront of development discourse. But for many years, there was not much discussion on inequality. But Professor Unku Aziz in 1957 itself did talk about poverty and inequality. The second thing is that one of the other points that Professor Unku Aziz made is that he said that the theory of rural development is about poverty. The key concept in the theory of rural development is poverty. And as a scholar for the Department of, as a graduate of the Department of Rural Development, as it was called those days, I'm very happy to note that he was talking about theories of rural development and the key concept of rural development being poverty. And a very interesting a piece of work of Professor Unku Aziz is he defined poverty in terms of the gap between the Malays and the non-Malay distribution of income. And he also went on to say that the definition and identification of rural poverty is directly associated with changes in the gap of inequality between 2 or more groups of income earners. This is a very important point that Professor Unku Aziz made, and not a lot of attention has been actually focused on this dimension of his research, and as well as the differentials between rural incomes and non-rural incomes that is important. And this is again when we talk about inequality. So the discussion on inequality is not new. It's way back. It can be traced way back and tracked to the work of Unku Aziz in the 50s. And also Professor Unku Aziz talked about the question of poverty, proteins, and disguised starvation. And you would think that, is that work relevant in today's discussion? Of course it is. There are studies showing that there is malnutrition, there is undernutrition, there's malnourishment in the urban areas. So the fact that Professor Unku Aziz recognized the role of proteins, the diet of individuals, especially in the rural areas, and he linked it to the mental capability and to life expectancy. These are 2 very important factors. And if you want to increase your life expectancy, Professor Unku Aziz said that you should consume a considerable amount of protein. And what is interesting about this particular research and development, research of Professor Unku Aziz, is the fact that the current food poverty line is talking about the food component of the poverty line, talks about food servings. And if you look at the composition of the food servings of the food poverty line of the 12th Malaysia plan, you would see that there are several protein items that are mentioned, and they're no longer talking about caloric requirements. They're talking about talking about servings of food, which should include meat, eggs, cereal, and all the other things. So the two factors of protein as well as having a balanced diet are very important dimensions. And this is something that Professor Unku Aziz also spoke about. And even in his later work, this was actually mentioned. And he had several criticisms of the way in which poverty, the approaches to poverty were carried out in the country, even as late as 2009 and even in 1975. And I wish the policymakers had listened more closely, because they're repeating the same mistakes in the current definitions. He had his reservations about using a target group approach. He had his reservations, and he felt that the distribution of income would have been a better measure of poverty rather than currently used measures, including the PLI, which I have my own reservations about. In addition to that, Professor Unku Aziz also came out with his own measurement of poverty, which he called the Sarong Index. And there's a lot of discussion about the Sarong Index, and at that point in time, it was relevant. But I must say something. On the eve of the launch of the center and the chair, Professor Unku Aziz walked into our rehearsal, and we had already had the video. And at that point he was there, we were talking about his Sarong Index. And he said, "I don't like the Sarong Index, please remove it." That's on the eve of the presentation. No need to say that the organizers almost had a heart attack. Okay, so Prof. Unku, towards the later part, didn't totally subscribe to the Sarong Index, and he didn't want it mentioned at the launch of the center and the chair. So that is something that I see a lot of researchers still talk about the Sarong Index, but it's also good to know that Professor Unku Aziz is not actually talking about the Sarong Index, or didn't talk about the Sarong Index much later in his work. The other factor that Professor Unku Aziz talked about are the roots of poverty. And he did a very interesting analysis of talking about poverty during the pre-colonial days, the colonial days, and post-colonial days. And what is interesting is that he identified three major causes of poverty, which is well documented. I don't need to go into that. Basically, he said it was productivity, he said that the roots of rural poverty and poverty among the Malays was mainly due to the neglect by the colonial administrators, and this was to some extent perpetuated in the post-colonial period. And he, of course, his famous monopsony system also was mentioned, and he looked at various policies and programs that were actually perpetuating the system post-colonial period. So again, this was an interesting dimension of Professor Unku Aziz's work on what were the roots of poverty in the urban and in the rural areas. And of course, he talked about exploitation, and he talked about and also there are two other very interesting dimensions that Unku Aziz mentioned, which is seldom mentioned, except I think Santri Zaki mentioned it in her speech. Professor Unku Aziz, way back, did say that poverty has no racial barriers, and that although rural poverty was a Malay problem, and this was because the Malays made up the majority of the rural population, and 90% at that time of the Malays were rural people. So that is why the rural poverty was associated with the Malays. But Unku Aziz has explicitly stated in his work, and this is never mentioned in many of the discourses in poverty, that poverty did not know any racial barriers. But what's interesting is that when you look at the new economic policy, one of the prompts of the new economic policy is influenced by this thinking of Professor Unku Aziz, which says the eradication of poverty irrespective of race. That means there was a recognition by the policymakers that when you eradicate poverty, you eradicate poverty of the poor. You do not look at somebody and say, I am not going to eradicate your poverty because of your race. So that was very explicitly mentioned in the policy document. And that the NEP and the recent discussions that we are talking, that we are having on whether the NEP continues to be relevant, and it does. And this is what the outcome of the discussions is, that the NEP is still very relevant. And whether in its original form or in a modified form or changed form, that's another platform for discussion. And also when Professor Unku Aziz also talked about solutions to poverty. And when he spoke about solutions to poverty, he said that that only if the root causes of poverty were addressed could poverty in the rural areas be resolved. Rural development would only be successful if the root causes of rural poverty, that is the main causes, low productivity, exploitation, and neglect, were actually adequately addressed. And also, one of this very interesting point, and for researchers on poverty, you probably agree with me on this, the proliferation of agencies dealing with poverty is monumental. And when we want to do research on poverty, we have to deal with numerous agencies, more than 20 agencies. And Professor Unku Aziz made the point that the increasing establishment of these authorities was symptomatic of the realization of the continuing inadequacy of programs to combat all the causes of poverty satisfactorily. So the creation of more agencies, the provision of infrastructure, does not solve the poverty problem unless you address the root causes of poverty, in particular rural poverty. So, and also, Professor Unku Aziz said the eradication of exploitation and the introduction of modern technology into the rural area would actually help towards reducing rural poverty. So what has changed in the Malaysian scenario? And here I want to, if I have a little bit of time, I don't know how much longer I have. I'm not being given a warning signal, so I'll just talk. One of the things that has changed in the Malaysian scenario as far as poverty is concerned and the conversations of poverty is that poverty is no longer a solely rural phenomena as it was in 50s, 60s, 70s. Poverty has become also an urban phenomena. But the programs and policies to eradicate rural poverty will not work in the urban settings because the whole context is different. Even as something as basic as definition and something basic as conceptualization of urban poverty, for the urban areas, it's very different from that of the rural areas. And even the poverty line that is used in the rural areas is not very relevant in the urban areas. So the scenario of poverty has changed. That is one factor that I want to mention. A second factor is that while there is the Ministry of Rural Development very clearly in charge, the main agency responsible for the eradication of rural poverty, in the case of urban poverty, I'm still struggling to find a ministry that is responsible for the eradication of urban poverty. And this is a big challenge because when nobody is in charge, you don't see any results. And there are some discussions from the EPU, etc., that they're going to try and centralize some things, and also to centralize the database on poverty, set up a centralized unit to try to bring all these agencies under one roof, and various other conversations are going on at this point in time because of the 12th Malaysia plan. And also the other thing that is very important is that the poverty line has been revised, and I do see major improvements in the way in which poverty has been conceptualized, but I still have my reservations of using poverty to demarcate the poor, and also the concept of relative poverty through the term that's very commonly used, that is B40. And what is interesting and also useful and progressive is that they've realized that the B40 are not a homogeneous group, and they've got different categories of the B40. And the hardcore poor are those who cannot meet the incomes needed to actually cross that food poverty line. So that is a very important policy change. So Professor Unku Aziz's work continues to be very relevant. 6 decades later, people are still talking about poverty. People are still talking about the poverty line, the conceptualization, the definition of poverty, and also policies and programs. And everybody is still grappling with all of these issues that are significant in the case of poverty, both urban and rural poverty, and also the manifestations. And what is happening in Malaysia is that there are pockets of poverty, and Malaysia cannot cannot be thinking about or should not be thinking about moving to a developed nation status until you solve the problems of the poor and try and solve the problems of both the urban and the rural poor. And also, one of the features that has happened is that when you talk about urban poverty, it is very multi-ethnic. Because whoever lives in the urban area, and if they cannot meet, they cannot earn incomes that are linked to the PLI, then they're classified as the urban poor. So let me just use the last 5 minutes. I see a little note up there on this one. I would just want to focus a little bit on the pandemic and what has happened during the pandemic. A lot of issues have cropped up with respect to poverty during the pandemic. Many of the M40 have actually moved into the B40 category. Basically, whether they're going to remain in the B40 or not will depend on the kind of the recovery process that the new B40 actually is what kind of recovery process there is, and what kind of support they're going to give that will be there for recovery. The second thing that has cropped up is the fact that during the pandemic, the impact of the pandemic on various groups and individuals in the different poverty groups is also something that is of concern. For example, domestic violence has escalated, and this is violence against women, violence against children, etc. The pandemic and this comes back to the discussion of having the kind of environment that they're living in. You see, when you have a small apartment or a PPRT flat, which is very small, it is, I think, bearable if you just come in to just have come in to just sleep at night. But when you are there 24/7, this becomes a big challenge. The other aspect that is also the pandemic has caused is the impact on education. Education, or all education, education of school children, education, the university education, and also we assume that everybody can go online automatically. But the realities on the ground are quite different. People don't have access to the gadgets that's needed. People don't have access to the telcos that are needed to give you stable internet so that you can access your online classes. And these were things that people never ever thought about. Because automatically everybody says, let's go online, work from home, work online. You have one handphone. How do you manage that? If you have just got one handphone, everybody needs to use it. So it causes a lot of stress. And one dimension of poverty is also the mental health and well-being of individuals in the B40 and also amongst the poor. I mean, I'm not saying that people in other categories don't have mental health issues because of the COVID. Everybody has got mental health issues because of the COVID. But it is far, I think the manifestations of the mental health issues may be even higher because of the kind of houses, the kind of living quarters that the urban poor live in. So that could be another dimension that has happened. A third factor that's come into the discussion is the informal sector, and how during the pandemic, the informal sector was totally shut down. And a lot of people, both the people were involved in the informal sector for employment opportunities, and also people were dependent upon the informal sector for the supply of goods and services. People, especially in the lower income groups, needed the informal sector so that they could access goods and services. So with the collapse of the informal sector during the pandemic, what has happened is that income flows were disrupted. The cost of living actually went up for many groups. And the other thing that has happened, which is I think a positive thing, is that the informal sector has come into the forefront of discussion on poverty, and also ignoring the informal sector will not cause it to go away. The moment the pandemic gives opportunities for opening up the economy, the first sector to open up is the informal sector. So the best thing is to learn how to work with the informal sector. That is another aspect that's come up as a result of the pandemic. And another factor that's very important, it has shown the resilience of communities in surviving the effects of the pandemic. And also it has brought to the forefront the NGOs and the efficiency of the NGOs in doing basic things like delivering food supplies. If you look at the cost of food delivery by government agencies versus NGOs, you see there's a huge gap. So those are the things that the pandemic has brought to the forefront. So there are a lot of useful lessons to be learned from the pandemic, and also to build up the resilience and the sustainability of communities and individuals, so that if another shock of this magnitude hits, it will be dealt with in a better fashion. And is that my time up? Okay.
Yeah, I think, yes.
Okay, I will stop on that note. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Prof. Sulu. It's very enlightening short talk. It's very interesting to note that Pak Ungku did not want the Sarong Index during the launch of the center and the chair. Very interesting,
yes.
But do you know why though?
We didn't. We were in a state of shock. We didn't ask him why.
All
we
right.
were in a state of shock.
Okay.
So
Anyways,
it was like the day before the launch. It was not like a week before, and it was like I think mid-afternoon or something. So so we don't know why. I've been asked the question in earlier seminar too. We don't know why.
All right.
I don't know why.
But I think you brought up something very important, which is ultimately very, very critical for us to still look at what Pak Ungku mentioned, and he practiced in his work, is that we need to look at the root causes of poverty. That is the most important. In order for us to solve the problems, we need to really understand the root causes, and we have to look at rural and now urban very differently. And people usually forget the urban now, and as you said, there's no real ministry or a government department looking at it. But it's good to hear that you say that they are actually looking at something centralized. A centralized unit to look at both urban and rural poverty together, so that nobody is left out, nobody is left behind, as per our SDGs. So hopefully we can all work together and to carry on Pak Ungku's good work to try to reduce as much as we can with this pandemic, and one day eradicate it. Okay. I'd like to go on to the second speaker. I think Prof. Sulu, you have questions already in the Q&A box.
Okay, I will try and look at it.
Okay. Second speaker, Yang Bahagia Datuk Dr. Madeline Burma, has 35 years of experience in the field of development economics, which includes areas of poverty, inequality, rural development, and underserved marginalized communities. Dr. Madeline is currently an honorary professor at UNIMAS, a fellow of the Academy of Sciences of Malaysia, and a commissioner at the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, Suhakam. This afternoon, we shall listen to Dr. Madeline discuss the interesting topic on why does poverty persist even when economic development takes place in Sarawak, the paradox of persistent poverty amidst high economic growth in the state. I understand that Dr. Madeline is in the field now doing work, and so we shall listen to her pre-recorded talk. For those participants who have questions for her, please include your questions in the Q&A box, include your email address so that the secretariat of this conference can forward your questions to her and revert to you with her answers, yeah? So, okay, secretariat, you can play her recording now.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Madeline Burma. Today I'm going to make a presentation titled Poverty Amidst Plenty, the Paradox of Economic Growth in Sarawak. Before I begin my presentation, I would like to say thank you to University Malaya, particularly the organizers of the development through the lens of Royal Unku Aziz, a man ahead of his time webinar, for inviting me to share my thoughts and experiences in conducting research on poverty in Sarawak. Thank you very much. Before we begin this discussion, allow me to introduce myself. Now, as you can see here, I'm a fellow of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia. I'm attached to 2 universities, and I'm also attached to 2 what we call a commission. Yeah? One is a Human Rights Commission, and the other one is a Malaysian Competitive Commission. Well, in terms of my presentation, there will be 4 parts to it. Number 1, I will discuss on poverty amidst plenty in the state of Sarawak, followed by COVID-19, poverty and orang asal in Sarawak, and followed by what worked in the past and the way forward. Now, I would like to begin this presentation by quoting these very famous lines by Royal Professor Unku Aziz. This is in Malay. I quote, "Kita harus kembali ke akal fikir, merujuk kepada kebijaksanaan dan mencari segala kepandaian untuk berhadapan dengan cabaran. Kita harus menyusur akar bangsa, mencari ke dalam semak dan belukar, rahsia kejayaan dan kekuatan anak bangsa dalam menghadapi cabaran zaman." This is one of his very famous quotes, how he was talking about the need for us to find solution to problems or the issues faced by our communities. Royal Professor Unku Abdul Aziz, or Pak Unku, as he is fondly remembered by his students or his colleagues, is the first economist in Malaysia to pinpoint discrimination, neglect, and institutions as the major causes of poverty and obstacles to development at the individual and communal level. So if you notice here, the 3 words were discrimination, neglect, and institution as the 3 major causes of poverty and obstacles to development at the individual and communal level. So I would like to take these 3 elements, or rather these 3 factors, and to contextualize it in the context of Sarawak economic development. This is going to be in my next presentation. In this presentation, I will focus first on this topic called poverty amidst plenty, using the 3 causes of poverty, and to see how does the interplay of these 3 factors in Sarawak economic development. Now, in this section, I will focus on Sarawak's socio-economic landscape and provide the context for this discussion under the title of Poverty Amidst Plenty. Now, if we notice here, Sarawak, in terms of its GDP growth, it is about negative 7.1. But in terms of its contribution to Malaysia, in terms of percentage, it contributed about 9.5% to the national economy. Now, it is one of the 6 states in Malaysia, and of the 6 states, they contributed about 72.1% of the gross domestic product of Malaysia. So Sarawak is a major contributor in terms of economic growth. Although Sarawak is one of the major contributors to the national economy, we find that the income in Sarawak is still relatively low compared to the national average or to some of the states. Now we notice here the one in orange, this is what we call median income. So median income of Sarawak is about 4,554 compared to the average, the national median income, which is 5,873 ringgit, and compare that to Wilayah Persekutuan Kuala Lumpur, which is 10,549. Another aspect that we can see is that in terms of median monthly gross income of Sarawak, it has always been very much lower than the Malaysian or the national average. Now, if we look at the average monthly income and wages for year 2019, we can see that Sarawak is one of the states that have an average monthly income and wage that is below the national average. The national average is 2,933, and you can see here that Sarawak is 2,509. So although Sarawak is one of the biggest contributor to the national economy, but in terms of wages, it's still very, very low. Now, this chart shows the incidence of poverty by states in Malaysia for the year 2019 and 2020. Now, we can see from this chart, there are 3 states that have the highest incidence of poverty. The poorest is, of course, Sabah, followed by Kelantan and Srawat. So interestingly, we can see that the 2 Borneo states are among the poorest in the country, and the third is, of course, there is Kelantan. Now, specifically, if we look at the absolute poverty here, the 3 states in terms of in year 2019, Sarawak, the percentage of absolute poverty is about 9%. The highest is Sabah with 19.5% and Kelantan 12.4%, which is far above the 5.6% for the national average. Now, if we look at in terms of relative poverty, the incidence of relative poverty is equally high for Sarawak. We can see here it's about 15.2%. But of course, there are other states. For example, Malacca and Malaysia has a very high, for example, 16.9%. So Sarawak is a bit, or rather slightly lower than the national average, but it's still very high as compared to other states, except for in comparison to Selangor and Malacca. So Sarawak has a very high incidence of absolute poverty and also relative poverty. Now, in terms of the districts with the lowest median and mean income for Malaysia, you can notice that the median, based on median income, 6 poorest districts in Malaysia are in Sarawak. So you can see that they are Pusak, Julau, Tempeduk, Pakan, Song, and Kenawit. And in terms of mean income, the poorest district here is Pusak. Pusak is in Sarawak. And 7 districts in Malaysia are from Sarawak. So this shows to us that the poverty, the incidence of poverty is still very high in the state of Sarawak. Now, even if we look at the rural-urban strata, there are 2 things that we can see from this chart. Number one, there is a difference, there's a big gap between urban household income and rural household income. That's number one. I think that is very peculiar in terms of not only in Sarawak but also in other states. And another thing is that Sarawak has one of the lowest household income. The other states are Sabah and Kelantan. So that really shows that there is a lot of issues, or it's rather because of probably the gap is probably due to neglect, or rather due to structural issues that has not been resolved in the last few years. Now, in terms of median income by strata, also urban and rural, as you can see that even throughout the years, the gap is getting getting wider and wider between rural and urban. Like for example, in 1995, the gap is not as broad, or rather as wide as between the year 2019. So this shows that the urban-rural gap is getting wider in the state of Sarawak. Now, I would also like to share the labor force key statistics for the state of Sarawak. Now, as you can see here, the labor force participation rate is about 67.5%. However, if we look in terms of gender, we find that male have about a higher percentage in terms of LFPR, or labor force participation rate, which is about 82% as compared to women. So the underutilization of women in terms of its labor force participation rate. Now, in terms of graduates, we can see here that graduate unemployment is rather low, which is about 4.2%. But in terms of the unemployment rate, we can see that Sarawak registered a relatively high unemployment rate, which is about 4.7%. So and this is something that is of concern. And another thing is that look at the graduate wage and income. The median income and the average income, median is about 3,915, and in terms of average is about 4,300 ringgit. This shows that it's not much different from all the other states in Malaysia. But however, if you compare that to the bigger cities like Kuala Lumpur and those in Selangor, it is relatively lower than what is being paid in Selangor or Wilayah Persekutuan Putrajaya and Wilayah Persekutuan Kuala Lumpur. Now, like for example, the graduate median monthly wages and income by state, you can see here that Sarawak here is they are paying slightly above the total for Malaysia, but it is much lower, as I mentioned, than Kuala Lumpur or even Putrajaya. So this explains why many Sarawakians out migrate, or rather they will find employment in Kuala Lumpur, in Selangor, or even in Johor. It's very popular, although Johor is considered as less in terms of income, but many of the Sarawakians will go to Johor as a stepping stone to go and work in Singapore. Now, we'll look at the facilities. Another thing that I would like to share is in terms of facilities. Now, I have included here in terms of access to public and private health facilities. The second one is to educational institution, and the other one is electricity supply. Now, I would like to highlight here, if you notice, in terms of access to public health centers, about 15.5%, we notice here that who claim that they have the way the public health centers are more than 9 kilometers away. And in terms of private health, we find that there are even higher percentage, that is about 33.3%, who claim that the distance of their residents to these two facilities. Now, in terms of educational institution, we can see here from the residents to the schools, or rather primary school, about 2.4% claim that their primary school is about more than 9 kilometers away from their residence. And in terms of secondary school, 18.1% claim that their residents are more than 9 kilometers. And those with supply of electricity, you can see that only 0.2% who claim that they do not have electricity. So the issue of access to public and private health facilities and educational institutions are of deep concern. Now, these are internet connectivity, and you can see that in Sarawak, the internet connectivity in rural areas really is the lowest in the country. Now, in terms of broadband connectivity, Sarawak is also one of the lowest in the state. And in terms of access to computer, we can see that Sarawak is one of the few states that has a relatively low access to computer in the country. Okay, in this section, I would like to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on indigenous communities, because this is the issue of access to vaccination and issues that are related to COVID-19, such as access to bank, education facilities, and also to health facilities. Yeah? Now, if you seek that, notice that COVID-19 posed enormous risk to the physical and cultural existence and traditional livelihood of the indigenous people, because this is very much related to the movement control order, which prevented them to have access to the forest, where that is what they claim to be their supermarket. Now, in terms of loss of livelihood, jobs, and means of subsistence, because many of them have to they have to travel to town to get their basic necessities or consumption goods. But they found that these are no longer available because they do not have access to the jungle. And this poses a lot of problem in terms of their sustainable livelihood. Now, at the height of the movement control order, or rather the MCO1 as we call it, many indigenous communities ran out of food supply and had to rely on temporary food aid due to loss of income. So this lack of access to adequate food results in hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition. Now, if we look at another thing, is that lack of access to relevant information in local languages. So many of the language are done in the standard Bahasa Malaysia, English and Chinese, and Iban, and a few. But in Sarawak, there are more than 49 sub-ethnic groups. So this has posed a serious a challenge to those for those who are living in the interior or those in the rural areas, because they do not have access to relevant information related to COVID, because the information were mostly not in their mother tongue. So another challenge faced by the indigenous communities during the MCO is that they do not have, or rather they have very limited access to their fishing, gathering and hunting grounds. This is basically their supermarkets. They are deprived of their means and access to their realization of their right to food. So this is a human rights issue. For those who are living in the rural and in the interior, one of the challenge that they face is that they have very limited access to healthcare facilities. So Sarawak, though, I mean, as we know, is one of the largest state in the country. So there is a problem of accessibility or logistics in terms of accessing to healthcare facilities. Another aspect that I would also like to highlight is that lack of remote learning opportunities for children, or rather particularly those among the indigenous children. So in fact, in Malay, they said ada buaya, Wi-Fi tiada. This is what it means, is that there is a crocodile, there are crocodiles, but there are no Wi-Fi. So these are another challenge for, these are the paradox of development in Sarawak. I'm also sharing some newspaper clippings about the paradox of development in the state of Sarawak. For example, there are mentions about 1,000 dilapidated schools in the state, and also how there is very limited access, or rather difficulties faced by the rural communities in accessing banking facilities. For example, in obtaining their bantuan sara hidup support system provided by the government, how they have to come at as early as at 2 a.m. in the morning just to be in the queue, and also how the residents of Pakan, which is one of the poorest district in Sarawak, who have to travel long hours just to get the travel permits, and just to go to the for them to enable them to access the nearest ATM. And also another one is the sharing of space, urban space, or rather land in the what you call Kampung Cawan, where the living and the dead were sharing the same space, or this is a slum area. Yeah, thank you. Now, I would like to mention that having gone through the data and all the analysis on the state of economic development of Sarawak, there are things that I realized that what worked in the past will not work in the future. For example, the economic growth of the state is getting slower, and we find that COVID hit Sarawak that is already so unequal. And we find that women, youth, and PWDs and indigenous communities are paying the greatest economic price. So there's a lot of attention that needs to be focused on the development of them, of this group. The M40 are slipping through the cracks, not only the B40, but we find that the M40 are also experiencing a lot of challenge, especially during the MCO. There is also unemployment and underemployment. In the past, the focus has always been unemployment, but now we notice that underemployment, which is whereby, especially in terms of skill related underemployment, whereby people are employed in fields or economic activities that are below their qualification. And also the COVID-19 clearly shows that many of the Sarawakians in the rural areas are subjected to very precarious livelihood. Another important thing that I noticed during my research is that I found that the federal-state relationship has changed, and I think the state is going to have greater autonomy and stronger voices in demanding for the rights to development. Number 8 is environmental, social, and governance, or what we call the ESG. Yeah? And 9, resilient and preparedness is going to be a part and parcel of future development efforts. And finally, number 10, politik atap zing can no longer be the winning point to win the people's votes, especially for those in the rural areas. Yeah. For the last part of my way, for poverty eradication, the way forward is that development projects, we need to humanize economic growth. In terms of development model, there needs to be shared prosperity. In terms of development trust, there needs to be a rights-based approach. And there is need to have strong focus on developing human, or rather basic amenities and human capital. And of course, sustainable livelihood. And in a post-COVID environment, digitalization is one way. It will definitely broaden, or it can also narrow the gap between the have and the have-nots, between urban and rural. And now, after discussing the paradox of economic growth, poverty amidst plenty, what are the things that we can learn from Royal Professor Unku Aziz? Now, to summarize it, I would like to say Sarawak economic development, where human economies care for people, where the state is without exploitation and with income security, and the state rewards work and not wealth. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Terima kasih. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Madeline. That was very insightful. Personally, for me, so many things I've learned from her today, and I hope that you have too. It's such an eye-opening thing to know that the income gap has over time progressively widened between rural and urban communities, and that there is underutilization of women in the labor force, 50% only utilization. And also the high percentage of unemployed graduates in Sarawak. And the fact that, there's lack of remote learning opportunities. I didn't know that Sarawak was the worst hit state, where the internet connectivity is the worst, and access to computers, broadbands, is the worst in Sarawak. And let's work together to try and help the state as much as we can. And also learn that indigenous communities have so many much more challenges than we. Just imagine language, and because of language, it poses serious problems, as they don't have enough information to protect themselves against COVID, because the information is not in their mother tongue. So, this really poses something for us to think about, and let's work together towards supporting the state to improve the situation. All right, if anyone has any questions for Dr. Madeline, please put in your email address so that the Secretariat can forward to her and they can forward to you her answers. All right, so go on to our third speaker, Dr. Rafik Idris, who is a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Business, Economics and Accountancy at University Malaysia Sabah, UMS, and the Director of Center for Investment, Endowment and Wakaf. He's also the Associate Fellow of Unku Aziz Center for Development Studies, and the Chairman of the Sabah Economic and Education Society. Dr. Rafik's research interests include development economics, international economics, monetary economics, and health economics. And he is active in social work involving rural schools. This afternoon, Dr. Rafik will discuss poverty, inequality, and development in the state of Sabah, a state very rich in natural resources, but at the same time having the highest poverty rate in the country. Dr. Rafik, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Haja Yateha, for the very kind introduction. First of all, I would like to thank the University of Malaya and specifically Unku Aziz Center for Development Studies for inviting me to be one of the panelists for this conference. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I will use my 20 minutes of presentation to focus on few areas very quickly. Okay, I will touch on I will give an overview about Sabah's economy. Then I will give a snapshot about poverty and inequality in Sabah, trying not to repeat what that have been mentioned by Dr. Madeline Burma. I'll try to explain why the poverty rate in Sabah is always among the highest in Malaysia and now the highest in the country. And then later I will give my personal view, recommendations, the way forward for the reduction in poverty and inequality in Sabah. So my focus will be on explaining why poverty is still high. Okay, why the poverty rate is still among the highest in Malaysia. Okay, for the case of Sabah. I will not talk about poverty measurement and issues related to it. In fact, this topic is very subjective, and in many different places, it's quite unique. For example, when we talk about poverty in Sabah, there are people who are maybe categorized or fall under the poverty definition. Their income are below the poverty line, but they do have maybe big size of land. They may have few acres of land, and they do not have a problem with access for food, for example. So it's very subjective, but I will not touch on that. Okay, so while conducting my research, okay, I had the opportunity to go to each and every district in Sabah. I would say since 2019. So I conducted a study on Sabah's economy. I went to each and every district in Sabah, and I went to see people from the district office as well as business communities and individuals and NGOs to give their inputs with regard to Sabah's economy and the poverty and inequality in Sabah. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, first I will talk about Sabah's economy. Okay, let me start by discussing Sabah's economy since gaining independence in 1963. Okay, since we formed the Malaysian Federation in 1963, Sabah has achieved many changes in terms of economic development. Okay, over the years, infrastructure facilities have been gradually improved. Okay, per capita income have increased. Poverty rates have also, I would say, reduced significantly. Sabah is also among the largest producers of rubber, cocoa, petroleum, and gas in Malaysia, and one of the major contributors to palm oil production in the world. Okay, in addition, trading performance is of no exception for Sabah. Okay, Sabah's trade was reported to be just worth about 150 million sometime in 1962, before the Malaysian Federation was formed. Okay, while in 2019, for example, trade value was reported to be worth more than 21 billion US dollar. From an economy that was heavily dependent on agriculture, fisheries, forestry, and logging, Sabah has undergone a process of transformation, in its economic structure by stages. In the early and mid 1970s, for example, the agriculture, fisheries, forestry, and logging sectors, as a whole, contributed more than 50% to the economy. The opening up and growth of mining and quarrying sector in the late 1970s has begun to diversify the contribution of economic sectors in Sabah. For example, by end of 1979, mining and quarrying sector has increased in terms of importance of its contribution to our gross domestic product. And also, I would say in 1970 and 1975, even in the early 80s, we started to expand our manufacturing sector. The contribution was just about less than 5% at the very beginning, then to less than 10%. And in 1990s, the first half of 1990s, just before the Asian financial crisis, we managed to achieve a double digit, I would say about 14% during that time. But then after the Asian financial crisis until now, the contribution of this manufacturing sector is always below 10%. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let me now discuss about poverty and inequality in Sabah. By giving a snapshot, Sabah used to be called a rich state. In the 1960s, 70s, 1980s, Sabah negeri yang kaya. Ramai orang mau berhijrah ke Sabah. They want to go to Sabah to work in Sabah. Sabah is a land of opportunity. And I would say even until now, Sabah is always in the top 5 for states that contributing to the contributing state, to the Malaysia's economy. We are endowed with the minerals, natural resources, natural beauty that many has not been fully explored. From household income perspective, at one time in the 1980s, for example, in 1984 to be specific, for example, Sabah was ahead of many other states such as Sarawak, Kedah, Perak, Kelantan, Terengganu, Melaka, Perlis, and Pahang. And in one specific year, even higher than Penang, for example. And we are higher than the nation's, country's average. But the situation is no longer the same. There are many other indicators that highlight the same thing. We are rich. We outperform many other states, but then we are overtaken. What actually went wrong? Sabah recorded the highest incidence of poverty currently, even for many years. Poverty incidence and the Gini coefficient index shows a declining trend, however, in the past 40 years. It is going down. But we, in terms of poverty, we are still the highest. And from district perspective, a district like Kudat, Tongot, Pitas, Beluran, and Telupit are districts which recorded poverty rate over 40%. In terms of income inequality, Sabah recorded the highest Gini coefficient, 0.397. There are certain specific districts like Semporna, Kudat, Kota Belud, Tongot, Pitas, Beluran, and Telupit are districts with Gini coefficient of above 0.4. Okay, looking from income status, okay, according to the World Bank in 2020, a country is considered as a high income country, okay, if its per capita income exceeds US dollar 12,696, or about 53 to 55,000 ringgit, okay, at current currency exchange. So where does Sabah stand at the moment? Are we close to reaching high income status? Now we are talking about wawasan kemakmuran bersama. Last time we have wawasan 2020, we want to achieve high income status. Okay, based on the data in 2019, prior to COVID-19 and the movement control order period, Sabah recorded the third lowest GDP per capita in the country. The per capita income in Sabah was only higher than Kedah and Kelantan. Yeah? The national GDP per capita was reported to be about 46,000 over ringgit in 2019. Okay, in the case of Malaysia as a whole, the country just needs another few thousand to reach high income status. But for states like Sabah, it is still a long way to go. States like Sabah, Kelantan need a big jump in its gross domestic product to reach that status. Okay, according to Sabah's current population and per capita income, our state needs to increase its GDP by more than 100%. Okay, maybe to more than 200 billion, then only we can achieve high income status. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let me now talk about poverty reduction in Sabah. Okay, it is interesting to note that while the state has been able to reduce its poverty rate over the years, yet in comparison with other states, Sabah remains to be the state with the highest incidence of poverty. Okay, I'll try to explain the possible reasons for this phenomena. Okay, firstly, I would like to touch about my view, the insufficient amount of allocation that Sabah received from the federal government. Okay, all this while for development expenditure. We normally receive around 4 to 5 billion a year. Okay, in my point of view, the amount is small for Sabah. Sabah is a big state. The size of certain districts in Sabah is equivalent to few states in Peninsular Malaysia. And due to this insufficient amount of allocation, we still have the issue of unstable supply of water and electricity. Okay, people have to, we have issue with regard to road connectivity. This is a basic need. Okay, can you imagine households living in rural areas are still struggling to get clean water and have to walk miles away to get it? Can you imagine on certain islands in Sabah, people have to spend over 100 ringgit for transportation costs via boat just to get mineral or drinking water from somewhere else? Okay, can you imagine families in rural areas who have to spend hours to get water supply? Okay, so the absence of good road connectivity has increased their cost of moving, okay, from one place to another. Road quality is not the same as those in other places. Okay, I would say also something related to school facilities. School facilities in certain places are not the same as compared to those in the cities. Certain specialist services do not exist in certain big cities in Sabah. So, so the point that I would like to emphasize here is that some big states, they need bigger allocation. Okay, secondly, I would like to emphasize, I would like to point out here is that the investment inflow to Sabah is relatively small. Okay, Sabah receives small fraction of direct investment inflow to Malaysia. Okay, maybe I would just to quote some numbers, okay, from MIDA, okay, for domestic direct investment approved projects. Okay, looking into data since 1980, Sabah always received less than 10% out of the total domestic investment, with exception to certain years, such as in 1981, 85, okay, 96 to 2006, 2012, and 2020. That is for domestic investment. And for foreign investment, Sabah never received more than 10% out of the total foreign investment that the country is receiving. looking into total approved projects, both domestic and foreign, as a percentage of the country's total investment, most of the time we receive less than 10%, with exception to for a few years only. So this is somehow, I would say, may explain the situation, okay, from a broader or macro perspective. Living in rural areas with some issues with regard to basic infrastructures will at the end lead to low level of education. Tidak ada air, tidak ada good access to water. We don't have good access to electricity in some places in rural areas. How do we expect them? They have to spend hours for that, to struggle in life, and how do we expect, okay, for them to have good achievement? Maybe some, maybe few, okay. So this group in big number will continue to be in this category. Okay, thirdly, I would like also to emphasize or to explain here is that Sabah is lacking in terms of downstreaming activities, which is very related to the second point. The manufacturing sector contributed less than 10% to our GDP in 2019. In most years, the manufacturing sector and downstream activities play important roles in the country's economy. In most developed and high-income countries, usually before attaining the status of high income, manufacturing sector will be the main contributor to the economy. Once they achieve high income status, then maybe services sector will take over. But for the case of Sabah, and I would say also for the case of Malaysia, that is not the case. Maybe this is what we call as the premature deindustrialization. Okay, looking at Malaysia and the state of Sabah in particular, much more need to be done to enhance downstreaming industrial activities. Okay, to increase downstream activities, it is not entirely the job of the government alone. Okay, the role of the private sector needs to be enhanced and encouraged. Okay, on the part of the government, efforts to facilitate the inflow of investment, as well as ensuring the cost of doing business is competitive or attractive compared to many places in the region, need to be introduced or further improved. Relocation of manufacturing plant or factories, attracting domestic and foreign investment are extremely important for Sabah. Okay, and fourthly, I would like also to mention here, it is also very important issue that may explain our situation is the problem of the undocumented population issue. Okay, these may also contribute to the situation. The existence of this community is all over Sabah. It perhaps takes few slices of our cakes. Okay, these long unsolved issues have adverse impacts on Sabah's economy. Okay, in fact, this issue would continue even after these people get documented. Okay, it may take some time for it to improve. Okay, and fifthly, I also would like to highlight here is that many workers in the construction and the plantation sectors in Sabah are not Sabahans. For plantation sectors, they are mainly by Indonesian, and for construction sector, it's mainly by the Filipinos. And this sector contributed, these two sectors contributed more than 20% to the economy. Okay, another point that I would like to make in this regard also is education level that I mentioned. It is low in districts with high incidence of poverty. What do we expect when we do not have education and the fact that opportunities are not much, especially in those districts? Okay, looking into the performance of other states in comparison, okay, supposed to be under the trickle-down economics. When the economy grows, all sectors will benefit. But players in the economy also should be benefiting, okay, enjoying the benefits of growth. But the trickle-down didn't really happen successfully in Sabah. Ladies and gentlemen, what is the way forward? As I mentioned earlier, the possible reasons that may explain why poverty rate in Sabah is higher than many other states are the small annual allocation by federal government, small fraction of direct investment in Sabah as a percentage of total investment in the country, lack of downstreaming activities. We have undocumented population issue. Okay, many non-Sabahan working in the construction and plantation sectors. So to solve this issue, we need a serious intervention, I would say, by the government, by the Malaysia plan, where priority should be given to states like Sabah and Kelantan to reduce the imbalance. Otherwise, it will just be an empty talk. That is to talk about balanced development. The relocation of Indonesia's capital city from Jakarta to East Kalimantan will give a new magnet to the Borneo Island. So the state must be equipped with the right infrastructure, the right ecosystem to support the economy. Another point I would like to highlight, investment promotion and approval must prioritize states like Sabah that are left behind. In fact, decentralization of decision-making on investment approval, even on investment promotion, wherever necessary, perhaps can be met at the state level. With that, I stop here, Dr. Hajai Lateha. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rafik. A lot of information there. Certain things we all know: infrastructure, undocumented populations, long-standing, large, unresolved issues in the state that require a lot of focus on. And you raise a very important fundamental issue, which is like infrastructure, and the fact that that affects even access to water supply, fundamental needs of a human being, which affects education, the levels of education because of lack of water supply, because human beings need to spend time to go out to look for water. So they cannot be spending enough time in the classroom or doing remote learning because they need to go out to search for water. So these are just fundamental access issues which we need to really focus on and hopefully address as soon as we can. Ultimately, these are long unresolved issues. I'd just like to let you know, Dr. Rafik, as I mentioned to you before, Yayasan Saim Dabi is giving quite a lot of scholarships to Sabahans to study at UMS and other colleges around the country. But we also do a lot of investments in Sabah in terms of environment projects, which also help the communities in Sabah, which we hope to do sustainably, as well as supporting those who due to the COVID, etc., etc. So Yayasan Saim Dabi focuses a lot in Sabah. Just to let you know, Dr. Rafik. All right, thank you. I'd like to go on to the fourth speaker, Professor Dr. Cik Wan Ahmad Zawawi bin Ibrahim, who is currently an adjunct professor at Taylor's University, after serving as a professor of anthropology at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences and Institute of Asian Studies, University of Brunei Darussalam, for almost a decade until 2020. Now, throughout his illustrious career, he has researched and published on globalization, religious governance, identity and multiculturalism, Malaysian peasantry, plantation proletarians, and indigenous communities throughout the country. This afternoon, Prof. Zawawi will provide us with a historical perspective on how indigenous minorities in Peninsular Malaysia, Sarawak and Sabah have been marginalized economically through the Malaysian state development process that has resulted in poverty amongst indigenous households. All right, so Prof. Zawawi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. First of all, I'd like to start with recalling sort of my memories of the late Royal Professor Unku Aziz. I was born in Kijal, Kemaman, And I remember when I was a student, a certain Professor Unku Aziz came and actually visited Kuala Kemaman. Yeah? And I remember, reading in magazines, him sort of going to the kitchen of fishermen and looking at what they were eating, the kind of diet they're on. So that was my first memory of Unku Aziz. Until later on, I actually joined when he was the Vice Chancellor. And of course, the last time I saw Pak Unku was when I actually delivered my professorial address at UC Malaya, and he attended. I was so proud the fact that he took time to attend my inaugural address, and he stayed there from the beginning to the end until we took some pictures with him. So on reading Pak Unku's writings on poverty, the points I remember very clearly is that, first of all, he sees poverty as a structural problem, yeah, not as an ethnic problem, but a structural problem. Exploitation, for instance, to him is a structural problem. It is not an ethnic problem. And of course, what Professor Sulo and Professor Madeline mentioned, agencies and institutions, very important causes of poverty. The what call that? The over indulgence with agencies of development, that sometimes they cannot coordinate with one another, and of course institutions, and that leads me to this particular point that I want to make, that when we talk about indigenous communities, we're talking about basically a perspective of development, yeah, that very much is in opposition to the perspective of development taken by so-called big agencies like the state. So the state, when we talk about development of the indigenous population, the nature of the state is very important. And we know that with the pronouncement of the new economic policy, we saw in Malaysia the beginning of what we call the developmentalist state, in order to organize, yeah, the implementation of NEP. It requires a force, a state that is organized, that is given the freedom, yeah, to exploit raw resources, the freedom to create capital, the freedom to even have legislation, yeah, and even the freedom of suppression, through laws that are meant to confront, yeah, resistance. Because when a development state takes its form, it is not just development, but it is also a force that has to be reckoned with, yeah. And sometimes the state would take certain action, like legislation, that may not be in favor of indigenous communities. For instance, the limitation of customary law, yeah, infringement of customary law, because customary law protects the land of the indigenous. We see this also in Srawat, for instance, the passing of several amendments to the Srawat Land Code in order to make sure that the natives, so to speak, do not object to the development process undertaken by the Srawat state under what they call Concept Baru. So a lot of amendments were made in order to facilitate the development process. And of course, there were resistance. So a developmental state needs to also take care of the resistance. And therefore, as we see, we have laws that repress this freedom of expression from indigenous communities. Okay. Now, I want to come back to my anthropologist friend, Professor Benjamin from Singapore, who has defined what indigenes mean. He calls them indigenes as opposed to exogenes. Now, this is very important differentiation. Yeah, indigenes mean people who look at the land resources as subject of labor. Subject of labor, which means that they see land as the basis of their spiritual life, you know, and livelihood. Land not to be seen as a commodity, to be sold for business, to be exchanged for business, but land as a basis of spiritual life. So this is what indigenes mean, yeah? Now the other term is exogenes. Exogenes is the contrast. Exogenes are those who see land as the object of labor, which means land is seen as a commodity to be turned into business for profit making. So these are the two contrasts, yeah, between indigenes and exogenes. And unfortunately, when we have a developmental state, the perspective is one that sees land and resources that relate to land as commodities to be sold, to be made into business for profit making. So that is the contrast, yeah? And a development state, in a sense, very much has faith in capital. Capital as the mover of development. It sees capital as the saver, as the medium by which development can take place. And therefore, in this respect, economic classes that relate to capital are given prime importance. So if you are, let's say, a Penan, you know, these are the nomadic Penan of Sarawak, they see the forest, yeah, they see the forest as their habitat, as their place, as their bank, actually, yeah, and they move without cutting trees because they're nomadic, and they move from one area to another area. So the forest has become the home, so to speak, yeah. But there is from the indigenous perspective, for the Penan, the land therefore has that particular quality, a spiritual basis of life, a place where they earn their livelihood without cutting the trees, but they hunt, and they hunt for sago, wild animals, and they move from one area to another. But from the developmental state point of view, the exogene, the forest is seen as business because it has logs. So businessmen, you know, in Sabah, we see how business tycoons have obtained tenders from the development state in order to log the forest. Yeah. So for the Penan, in a sense, their perspective of development has been usurped, yeah, by the development state. So here we have, in a sense, If we talk about the Penan or the Orang Asli or the Iban of Srawat or the Kadatan Dusun of Sabah, we see a similarity in terms of the indigenes, in terms of the way their perspective on development. That is, land. Land is the source of livelihood. Land is the source of the spiritual life. Now, historically, all these indigenous communities have experienced colonial rule, whether we talk about Peninsular Malaysia or Malaya at that time, or Sabah and Sarawak. And it's, of course, it's the British. And the colonial rulers did recognize customary law, whether it's been Sabah or Sarawak or in Semenanjung. So they believe in legal pluralism, and they have attempted through certain land codes, that they develop in Sarawak and Sabah to recognize this customary rights of the natives or of the Orang Asli. In Semenanjung, Malaysia, they recognize the Orang Asli had this notion of tanah saka. Saka means ancestral land. And this particular saka is transferred from generation to generation based on memory. For instance, an Orang Asli, we know what are the trees that their ancestors have grown. And these trees are then handed from generation to generation. So the British colonial power recognized the rights of the Orang Asli to use the land, but not to own the land. So in the legislation that they passed, they recognized the Orang Asli's right to use the land. But in terms of ownership, that was a different thing altogether. Even gazetted land of the Orang Asli do not have private titles, unlike the Malay Reserve, for instance, in which private titles are given. Of course, in Sabah and Sarawak, the protection is better for the natives, except that over time, the state began to make certain amendments to these land codes in order to facilitate the alienation of land to development, especially to plantation and to a commercial concept of development. So we have seen, for instance, in the evolution of legal pluralism in Sabah and Sarawak, we see basically the state gradually infringing upon the customary rights, by law, in order to make way for land to be alienated to their concept of development. So the concept of development by the Indians is very simple. They're into the market economy. It's not as if they're sheltered from the market economy, but they are more subsistence based. And whatever they exchange in terms of commodity, in terms of goods, they exchange for money that they use because they are cash. They need the cash to buy all the other facilities. So the household reproduction of the indigenous communities, whether you talk about bilik or you talk about the longhouse, is very dependent on commoditization. They're no longer sheltered from the use of money or commoditization. But that means that they have to turn some of the commodity into cash in order to use this cash to subsidize their household reproduction. Household reproduction means not just shelter, education, health, everything costs money. So whether the indigenous people like it or not, they need to exchange some of the commodity that they produce into cash. You know, some of them are for subsistence, but they have to convert some of those items into cash in order to underwrite the cost of living, the need for education for the children, transport, food that they cannot grow, sugar, coffee, and etc., clothes, etc. So the indigenous are caught in this kind of situation. But what they want, if you talk to, see, my research with the Orang Asli, in the post-colonial period, they were very much driven by the state policy of what they call regroupment center. Because you see, from the government point of view, they feel that the Orang Asli are scattered all over in small units. So from the point of view of economics of scale, they feel that it's difficult to bring development to a particular village because there's too many villages, and each village, you know, does not have a big population, small population. So instead of doing that, bring development to the different villages, they say, okay, bring all the villages out into a particular center, what they call regroupment center. In this particular situation, then they feel that there'll be economies of scale. We bring a big school, we bring a clinic there, we bring houses, we bring, you know, all kinds of development to this particular center. We bring cash crop, oil palm, where they can grow. And they are then relocated from the village to the regroupment center. But of course, in reality, things do not run as smoothly as planned. So what happened in this particular regroupment centers is that when the Orang Asli are brought in, they find that there's no work for them to do because the oil palms are still growing. And then they had nothing to do, so they had to go back to the village in order to go back to find work and employment. And of course, in these regroupment centers, even when the oil palm is harvested, they do not use the skill of the Orang Asli. They prefer getting contract labor from Indonesian and from Felcra. So the Orang Asli felt that, you know, they really had nothing to end. And the important thing is that in the village, they have a stake in the Tanah Saka, the land that they had access to. This is Saka land. They do not want to leave the Saka land because in the regroupment center, they're not sure in terms of the future, what is at stake for them. Can they be given perpetual access, ownership to this particular land in the regroupment center? You know, so these are questions which basically are not answered by the so-called regroupment center kind of project. For the Orang Asli, what they want is basically small is beautiful, which of course runs contra to the notion of development from the point of view of the development state. You know, small is beautiful. It's not on the agenda. For the Orang Asli, what they want is, we have this piece of land which I have access to. I want to grow crops on it, and all I need is fertilizer, so that I don't have to go to another piece of land and open up new land. This is what they used to do in the past. Yeah, they let the land fallow and they move to another land and they can come back again. That's what the natives in Srawat and Sabah also do. The idea of temuda. In Srawat, they call it temuda. There is land that they cultivate, but after a while, the plot of land can no longer furnish the kind of soil. So they let it fallow and they move to a new area and open up another temuda. Then they come back. Now, the orang asli doesn't want to do that anymore because land is scarce. So what they say, provide us with the fertilizers so that we can keep this particular land fertile to grow. And then we can also grow, we should be given access to this particular land, ownership, so that this tanah saka can be passed on to the next generation. So the concept of small is beautiful, rather than a commercial kind of development project. Now in Sabah, in Srawat, the natives face the same problem. And of course, first of all, when the development state took over under Taib Mahmud, logging was done in an excessive way, given to timber tycoons. So it gives way to a patronage system. The development state basically also becomes part of a patronage political system. Of course, in Semenanjung, we have UMNO that has its own patronage system, which distribute development goods, based on political allegiance and people in the circle. Same thing with Sarawak. So tycoons were given, the business tycoon were given a tender, to log, and of course after that came the hydraulic Bakun Dam. The same thing happened. Collusion between state and federal in terms of capital, and displacing the indigenous, the natives from the land. We've seen a lot of research on this in terms of the displacement problem, what I call deterritorialization. So what the development has done is to deterritorialize, meaning that they have displaced, dislocated, relocating indigenous people from the land that was flooded to a new area where it was only plantation, and land for them to use is only very little. Then of course came the Konsep Baru in Sarawak. Again, Konsep Baru was based on development based on commercial agriculture, plantation. And in this particular process, they amended laws that infringe on the customary rights of the indigenous population, to make way for compulsory, to make it compulsory for the indigenous to allow the state to take some part of the land in order to develop for 60 years or so, with them only getting about 10%. I think Professor Madeline Burma could vouch for this. Of course, in Sabah, as our speaker has spoken today, the plantation mode of development came early on, unlike Sarawak. From the colonial period until the post-colonial period, it was very much the alienation of land for plantation in a big scale. And in this particular context, we have the so-called capitalists from Peninsula who are very much monopolizing this particular agenda. And
Prof. Sawawi,
yes,
I'd like to ask you to wrap up just
sure.
within a minute. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So the worst enemy of the indigenous population is the developmentalist state. Developmentalism, the ism, that sees land as resource to be exploited, as commodity to be exploited, to be bought and sold in order for profit making, as opposed to land from the perspective of the indigenous as a source of livelihood, a source of spiritual life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Sawawi. It gives us so much insight about the structural problems that has given rise to and the result of the issues of the development of the indigenous communities in the country today. Land is a spiritual basis for life for the Orang Asli, the Orang Asli. and they move about without cutting trees. They live off the forest sustainably. Unfortunately, with development, not everything is sustainable. Thank you for sharing also the issues on the recruitment center. And although the idea is supposedly for good for the orang aslis on economies of scales, to bring them facilities all together and the cash crops, etc. But the question whether it is the best for them. All right. So I will just go through the Q&A. Maybe I'll go first to Prof. Sulo. Can you answer this question, Prof. Sulo? How does the binary college help the poor people change them and get them out of poverty? This person is asking, what does binary college do for the communities in terms of improving the livelihoods of people? Maybe Prof, you want to take that, Prof. Sulo?
That question, but since you're asking about binary college, and okay, if I was part Unku, I wouldn't answer any of the anonymous questions. Because if you want to ask a question, you should have the guts to put your name there.
Every single question here is anonymous, though.
What's wrong with putting your name? We're not going to put it with you. Okay, first,
would you like to answer? Yeah.
I will answer it. Okay, I will answer it because we've got nothing to hide. Yeah. Firstly, I don't know what binary college is doing because I'm not with binary college, I'm with binary university.
Oh, yeah.
And in terms of what we do at binary university, okay, firstly, I think you must understand the difference between a public university and a private university. A private university, it has to sustain itself using various mechanisms, and the key among that is the fees that the students pay. But having said that, binary university operates as a social enterprise, which basically means that everybody there, including the owners, take a salary. Okay, yes. That's one. And the second thing is that we do give scholarships, but we can't give thousands and thousands of scholarships. We give scholarships to the ones who have the merit and who are needy. So we use two categories to decide who gets the scholarship.
Maybe Prof. Sulo, I will share also that you also work with partners like Yayasan Said Dabi, where we have given scholarships for them to study at binary university. For example, these 3 talented, very, very poor girls from Cambodia who have learned so much from and they have changed from not what do you call it, knowing how to speak English at all to getting a diploma as well as a degree.
Right, and jumping up on the stage and giving a speech as well. But still,
so
we'll never forget that. So is that
yes?
So a foundation like Yayasan Sandabi has entrusted binary to change the lives of a very, very poor student. I mean, you guys know how poor this particular candidate were when they came. They come from
they are parents of very, very poor farmers. So yes,
poor farmers, and they come from a Cambodian Muslim community.
Yeah. So I hope the person who asked, anonymous person who asked the question, is happy with this answer. Binary University does do its part to assist the underprivileged. Yeah. Okay. There are also some questions on Sabah and Sarawak. So as Datuk Madeline is not here, maybe I'll ask Dr. Rafik for Sabah specifically. The question, I'll give you 2 questions here, Dr. Rafik. Who should be more responsible on the issues, the poverty issues in Sabah, the federal or the state government, and what should they do first to overcome the various issues?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the first question was about whose responsibility is this? Okay, I would say both federal and state government has its own responsibilities. Okay, at federal level, at federal capacity, according to our federal constitution, there are things which are called as federal lists, and there are things which are called as state lists, and there are things which are called concurrent lists, for example. So for me, both have their own role according to their capacity and according to the budget. State will act based on the financial capacity that they have. Okay, so how to solve? Okay, as I mentioned in my presentation, whatever being planned must be translated into action. Okay, I look the announcement by Yang Amat Berhormat Prime Minister a few months back, on which he mentioned that for 12 Malaysia plan, at least 50% of the allocation for basic infrastructure will be allocated for these few states like Sabah, Sarawak, and Kelantan, Terengganu, for example. Okay, so how to solve? They need to prioritize, need to reduce the imbalance between the states. Yep, I think that's my quick response. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rafik. Prof. Zawawi, can I ask a question, a personal one, on indigenous communities? Now, Yayasan Sain Nabi is a charity organization. We have done certain projects, even one currently now with ideas. They're having a webinar tomorrow on policies on addressing education for the Orang Aslis in the country. What would be your advice to me if I were to ask you, what is the biggest impact that I can make if I were to put in investment in the Orang Asli communities?
First of all, I would ask you what is your, I would say, what is the
sustainable impact?
The philosophy behind that.
I would like to make sustainable impact to lives in the Orang Asli community.
Okay. When you plan this particular so-called education agenda for the Orang Asli, who do you consult?
Okay, we're working with Ideas, the think tank, and they are currently working with the government, and they are having connections and focus groups within the Orang Asli communities around the country to do the research and to see where the gaps are. And they kind of like become the conduit between the Orang Asli and the policymakers in order to, try and close those gaps. So this is what we are doing now. But Prof, I'm asking something different. Like it doesn't have to be this, but in your mind, say if we have certain funds to put in any charity organization, where should we put it in to make the biggest sustainable impact to lives in the Orang Asli community? If you would share your thoughts and your views.
Well, education is important, but education without, so much of Orang Asli education has been very much imbued with agendas, Islamic agenda, and other kind of agendas, just like development. So what I feel is important in any project that relate to the indigenous population, you must bring them, you must have consultation with them, with their spokespeople, with the people who represent the Orang Asli. I think it's very important to have this consultation before you even begin.
Yes.
Because they have a lot of complaint in terms of what kind of education they have been given, in terms of the what they really want.
Okay. So this is what we are doing.
I think you cannot
without them
simply assume,
because we do not know
this is what they want.
Exactly. So we are doing that. That is a big part of what we are doing. We have focus groups and we are talking to them directly to understand what they need and the gaps that they are facing. So at least we are on the right track, yeah?
Yes. I see, there is a book by a Maori anthropologist. It's a very important book. It's called Decolonizing Methodologies, Research on Indigenous Communities. She is a Maori. She's married to a Maori, but she claims herself to be a Maori. And she posits in her book 35 research agendas for indigenous communities. Now, these research agendas, or this research projects, are not from above, but from within.
Mm.
Which means that for her, it's very important if you want to do research projects among the indigenous population, you have to go down to the ground and find out from their point of view, what are the kind of research they need? What kind of issues are at stake?
Okay.
You know, that is so important. You see, this reminds me of a particular article that I read way back when I was a student. I was exposed to this article. It's called Custer Died for Your Sins. It's written by a Red Indian, Vine Deloria, to the American anthropologist. Because every summer, he said, on the reserve, you know, the native Indians were put on the reserve. Yep. So every summer, he said, there is this stampede of anthropologists landing on the reservation camp.
Okay.
With your spectacle, with your notebook, with your camera, doing research. Okay, and then after that summer, they go back, hibernate. Next summer, they come back again with a new agenda. They say, oh no, the Indians are bicultural. Now, this particular author asks, what is the relevance of all this to our life? Our life is now in reservation. You know, we have nothing much to give, and our life is, you know, we are living under this condition. But when you come and do research, you never ask us about the present condition that we are in, how to improve our present condition. All you're interested is to reconstruct our life so that you understand about our big Red Indians, the warrior Red Indian. This is the kind of stereotype you want to create from this research.
Prof. Zawawi, I wish I can talk to you more. Maybe we can meet personally, because very interesting insights that you have. Thank you for that sharing and explanation. I think I'm going to ask one last question to anyone who takes it. I think Prof. Sulu highlighted that she would like to answer this question. I also open it to Dr. Rafik as well as Prof. Zawawi. Many poverty alleviation projects and programs are implemented by the government. Now, the question is, what are the important elements which drive good project governance in poverty alleviation projects in the public sector?
Okay,
Prof. Sulu, maybe?
Yes, I will answer that question briefly. Basically, government has taken responsibility for poverty alleviation. Okay, and my argument is that poverty alleviation is everybody's responsibility. But we don't see too many people coming forward to say, I want to do something for the poor. Okay, so that's my first one. So if the government doesn't implement those projects, there's nobody who's going to implement it. But now the thinking of government is also different. They want to work with NGOs, which is a big change in the way government is approaching the implementation of projects. And they realize that there's a huge problem when government implements projects, from the cost, the lack of knowledge, and the thing that one Zawawi just said, that they have no idea what's the causes of poverty, what the poor need. The same issues are not just for the Orang Asli, it's also for the poor. So right now we are saying that we need to understand, and it has to be, I mean, they talk about bottom-up approach, but it's really not bottom-up. So the other thing is that there is no accountability. Government gives money, projects are implemented, but nobody has a clue what the impact has been. Nobody has a clue how the money has been spent, and nobody has a clue as to whether the money could have been spent in a more efficient and impactful manner. What you're talking about. How can you sustain poverty eradication projects and programs? I mean, a case in point, which I've got strong reservations with, is the cash handouts that the government has been giving, the Bantuan BSA or whatever they had some different economies. So when we look around the globe, what we are saying is there are useful lessons from even our neighbors down south, that when you are going to give a cash handout or any handout of that sort, make it attach a conditionality to it. Because if you don't attach a conditionality, the cash that you give out to single people and etc. They use it on conspicuous consumption. We found out just by some very informal anecdotal studies that most of the cash that was given out under Bantuan Sara Hidup and whatever
It's been called at the moment.
Whatever it's called at this point in time. But what
Yes.
is happening was it was being used for topping up their handphone, their handphone credit, used to buy handphones, settle phone bills, and things like that. None of it was going to any activity that was going to help them come out of their poverty or any such thing. And you can't blame them for it. I don't blame the people who receive these cash handouts, because if somebody came and said, I'm going to give you this much of money,
Of course, you'll take it.
You're going to take it. You're not going to say, oh no, I'm not going to take it because there's no conditionality attached or whatever. So
it's not sustainable, yeah, Prof?
Not sustainable. It's not sustainable at all.
Right.
So governance is very important. Governance and accountability and monitoring and evaluation. We've been saying this since
every single project.
Work on poverty, not as long as Unku, but long enough.
Exactly, you hit the nail on the head, Prof.
Right. So those are the issues.
Thank you for that. Prof. Zawawi, Dr. Rafik, you want to add anything on to that?
I was thinking of what happened to Project Ikhtiar. Remember? There was a time when Project Ikhtiar was deemed as one of the solution, in which you do not give cash, but you talk about the ability of the respondents, of the people chosen, to be able to have a project that can create business, sustainable business of sort, and then you give the cash and then you monitor. What's happened to that?
I don't know. I've not heard about it in a long time. I mean, I'm aware of it, but I think it was Chamuri or somebody who's done some work.
Professor Gibbons was involved once.
Oh, you're talking about Amanah Ikhtiar projects.
With Shukor, Kasim.
Okay, I think it's still ongoing. Amanah Ikhtiar, I think they were mentioned in the budget and various other documents. I think, I'm not sure for the 12th Malaysia plan. I think if we're talking about Amanah Ikhtiar projects, I think it's still ongoing. But the thing is, again, back to they were implementing a lot better than because they were.
But can that be as a model? What we're looking for?
It's already a model, Zawawi. It's already a model in this country, where you.
It is already a model.
It is already a model. But the point is that, as in anything else, when the leadership changes, things change. Not too long ago, I was listening to Professor Muhammad Yunus.
Yes.
He's still very much into. Now he has evolved from giving microcredit to what do you call that? To social business in a very big way. And he was talking about having social business for health.
All right. Thank you for that sharing. Dr. Rafik, you want to add anything before we end? I think we're running quite behind time. You're on mute, Dr. Rafik.
No, thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
I think
all right.
Zama we have covered. Yeah.
Thank you. I've been privileged to chair this session with our three very esteemed speakers. Of course, Dato Madeline as well, who cannot be with us here today. Thank you for spending your time with us, participants. I have personally learned a lot, and I hope you have too. And to end it, I'll just say that let's all work together with the government in whatever capacity that we have to try and strive to eradicate poverty and carry on the good work of Pak Engku. Thank you. Assalamualaikum. Over to the MC. Thank you.
Waalaikumsalam. I would like to thank Dr. Hajayatila for chairing the lively discussions with our panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to an end. It is my great pleasure to invite Dr. Rohana Jani, the Acting Director of Unku Aziz Center for Development Studies, University Malaya, to give her closing remark. Please welcome.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon. distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Unku Aziz Center International Conference 2021, UACIC 2021, on poverty, inequality, and development, with the theme Development Through the Lens of Professor Unku Aziz, a man ahead of his time, has come to an end. On behalf of the Unku Aziz Center for Development Studies, I would like to extend our sincere gratitude and thanks to all participants from across different organizations, agencies, and countries. We have a participant from US, UK, Indonesia, China, to name a few, for being with us today for the past 2 days. With your participation, the conference successfully finished off this session. This conference was organized among other distinct objectives, mainly to honor the contribution of the Almarhum Royal Professor Unku Aziz and the highlights of the tribute to Almarhum Pak Unku. The focus of this conference is to get a comprehensive view in areas that he prioritized, such as the field of economic development, rural development, poverty, education, cooperatives, institutional development, namely Angkasa and Tabung Haji, and gender. To realize this vision, UACIC 2021 has invited speakers with professional expertise in these fields, reflecting and praising the thoughts of Pak Unku as well as the UAC research pillars. This conference has been made possible by a committed team who wholeheartedly assisted in the organization of this event. Our special heartfelt gratitude to Professor Dr. Eamon Terence Gomez, the former Dean of Faculty of Economics and Administration and Acting Director of UAC, for his valuable ideas, time, and continuous support to push the conference forward. Special thanks goes to the keynote speakers, and chairperson for their commitment and time in making the conference a success. At the same time, a special acknowledgement to the Royal Unku Aziz Chair Endowment Funders, namely Ministry of Education, University of Malaya, Petronas, Yayasan Samdabi, Employer Provident Fund, Bank Rakyat, and Pemodalan Nasional Berhad. I also wish to thank the university management, the Vice Chancellor, Professor Dato Insinyur Dr. Hamdi Abdul Syukur, Acting Deputy Vice Chancellor Research and Innovation, University of Malaya, Professor Dr. Sabri Musa, for their continuous support to the center. Last but not least, a sincere gratitude to the staff of the center, the UAC 2021 Secretariat and Scientific Committee, who have been responsible in coordinating the needs of the conference within their capacity and work tirelessly to ensure this conference a success. To all participants, may this conference be one that gains benefit that are fruitful and gravitates a deeper understanding of the issues discussed and deliberated on. We apologize for any shortcomings and glitches throughout the running of this conference. With that, I wish everyone a very pleasant evening. Hope to see you again in UAC's future events. Assalamualaikum, thank you, and stay safe.
Thank you, Dr. Rohana. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to an end of the UACIC 2021. On behalf of the committee members of UAC International Conference on Poverty, Inequality and Development, UACIC 2021, Development Through the Lens of Professor Unku Aziz, a man ahead of his time, I would like to express our gratitude for your presence and time to be with us for 2 days. Once again, thank you. Assalamualaikum and have a pleasant day ahead and take care. Stay safe. Thank you.